Well, my buddy Tim from Man Fabrications is letting me drive this awesome 1967 Ford F100. It sounds great and it feels great. We're going to show you how they did it coming up next on Motorhead Garage. Welcome to Motorhead Garage presented by Top Coat. Now this is the series where we take all kinds of great aftermarket gear and show it off, ways that you can make your car even better than it used to be. Now there's no way you can make this Ford F100 look any better, but you can make it perform better and feel like a modern vehicle. And that's where Man Fabrications comes in. Brent, how did you get started in this business?
Oh, it's a hobby gone berserk, really. I've always been a hot rodder, learned to drive on a Model A pickup. And I just found that I wanted something that was more modern, more capable on the road. Safer is, one part of it, but just more reliable, handle better and all that, be able to stay up with modern traffic. So that's what we went into.
And how did you get started? What vehicles did you work on first?
I had a career as an engineer, and I went and started this business in the backyard working on customers' cars one at a time. And then I found that I had some ideas on Mustang suspension in particular that I thought we could improve it. And I started putting those ideas into play on customers' cars, and that developed into a manufactured product we could then sell to another guy.
What kinds of things did you start doing differently from the start?
Well, bumpster was a big problem with some of the early Mustang II kits. There wasn't the understanding of geometry that we have today, and that's always been a favorite thing for me, is to understand that. That's my engineering background, I guess. And just drivability. You want a car that's totally predictable, that you can hand the keys to somebody that's never driven it before and you don't have to warn them about anything. The car should almost drive itself instinctively.
Now, this is a 67. You're talking early 80s when you got started. At what point did you start to realize these cars from the 60s and early 70s just didn't handle that well?
Oh yeah, from 48 and earlier, you've got to change the whole suspension. You really just have to. And these, they're okay, but they're not up to today's standards, particularly the Ford Twin I-Beam. A great work truck suspension, really not a good 85-mile-an-hour suspension. A lot of geometry issues. There's a lot of limitations to a Twin I-Beam design. And when you started particularly going from skinny nylon bias ply tires and you started putting wider radial tires with some serious grip on it, then the deficiencies of the suspension really, really show up. And when you update everything else on the car, the tires, the engine, and all that, you need to update the suspension because you overwhelm its capabilities.
Do you think that the chassis and suspension sometimes get overlooked when upfitting a car?
Yeah, I personally cringe when I see a car with a big motor and fat tires and a stock 1964 suspension. I'm going, there's room for improvement.
What are some of the things that you really like to focus on when you're building a chassis?
Well, it has to fit right, number one, and it has to be very solid because no suspension is going to work right if the chassis is twisting. That went back to the Model Ts. The chassis was part of the suspension, but on these you don't want that. An independent can't do its job if the frame is flexing, so strength is a big, big issue. And durability and fit are really big, and then putting a suspension in it that gives you the right stance, the right track width. There's different suspensions that are used that have problems with ride height or with track width that cause different problems, and we have solutions for those. The Crown Vic Front End on these Ford trucks in particular is an example. Stock front end is 7 inches narrower than a Crown Vic, so you can imagine the tire clearance problems that creates. Well, our Mustang-based suspension for that takes care of it. We have a new design we're coming out with that is actually turning the Twin I-Beam into a true independent.
I talk to a lot of engineers and they have a philosophy when they approach engineering. What's yours?
Well, mine is function over everything else. I believe that simplicity is the ultimate sophistication, and if I can do the job in the simplest way, I think it's more durable, it's stronger, and it also affects the price.
Well, thanks for being here, Brent. I see you brought one of your employees, or I should say former employees. Now, Tim, you've been with the company for 16 years and you've carried on that same philosophy. How have you embodied that in this new piece that you brought?
Well, this is one of our newest bolt-in kits that we've been developing. We've kind of taken that same philosophy, that form over function. We're using as many OE-style parts as we possibly can to make things simpler for the customer down the road. But like I say, this is taking a old-style car, modernizing it while allowing it to now take some of the more modern drivetrains that some of these customers want in these older vehicles. The suspension will just make this car drive and ride a lot better. It will take the later Coyote engines that are becoming so popular now, along with still some of the earlier engines that a lot of guys are still using. It makes these a better driving, riding car, something that a customer can, if they choose to, use on a relatively regular basis.
And this is for a Mustang?
Yeah, this is for 65 through 70 Mustangs and Cougars right now. We've looked into expanding the line to the later vehicles and stuff, but that's part of the engineering process to see the feasibility of doing it in some of the other vehicles. Like anything else, the way the factory engineers any vehicle, they're all different. So you have to work within those parameters you're given from the factory to adapt, if you will, what's going to work for that particular vehicle. It's not all kind of cookie cutter, one size fits all. It's got to fit that car and work with the geometry and the suspension setups or the structure that the factory's provided you.
Now, the GM folks are putting LS motors in, and now with Ford, it's the Coyote. So what have you done to accommodate such a large engine in this?
Well, and that's exactly the thing. An LS or even the later Hemis are a much more compact engine design. So they're afforded a lot more room in a vehicle. The Coyotes, by nature of the dual overhead cam design, you've got those large cylinder heads. They tend to get in the way of a lot of things. So with a vehicle like this, where Ford designed these with the shock towers, you're not fitting those in with those shock towers. Now the problem was with these cars, the way the structure was designed, these were one of the early unibody cars. Well, the suspension forces of those vehicles and the weight of that front end was designed to go into those shock towers through the bracing and ultimately into the firewall. Well, when you start cutting those shock towers out, you've lost half your structure. So the idea with doing this is with this internal plate here, that gussets that rail, if you will, even though it's really not a frame rail, strengthens up that. We've added the side bracing here now to kind of tie in there, but this kit also will include a set of plates to replace the shock towers, and we've incorporated in a similar system from the factory where you had your bracing that will ultimately go into the firewall. So you're maintaining that factory design of what Ford intended with that unibody structure. You're not weakening it, you're just giving it more room now for that Coyote. They still have their issues as far as, and this is part of the things we're working through, is what headers are going to work, what braking system, what master cylinders and everything is going to work, what modifications may be required in the transmission tunnel area, because let's face it, these big 6-speed and larger transmissions are a lot larger than an early C4 or even a C6. But this gets a basis to now work off of for those guys that are willing to do that to get those big Coyotes in there.
Well, you guys have thought of everything. I think that's pretty remarkable. You can check out Fat Man Fabrications at fatmanfab.com. Find out what they can do for your classic hot rod. We will be right back with more Motorhead Garage presented by Top Coat right after this.